She was looking for these gestures that were the rope that pulled to pull you through the darkness. All of the imagery, all of the sunrises of Mary Oliver poetry are our gesture to pull one out of darkness. And, we think of her as the poet of dawn or the poet of the sunrise. But what that really means is that you're the poet of darkness because you don't see the sunrise unless you're in the dark.
Welcome to the Guest House. I'm Shawn Perrell.
And I'm David Keplinger.
And this season, we are exploring a term that Emily Dickinson uses to describe the essence of practice. She called it our gem tactics.
She's talking about how our spiritual, artistic, and intellectual inquiries shape the way we meet each other and move through the world.
This season, our guests from various arenas of creative mastery are going to share with us how they have refined their gem tactics and thus their engagement with life.
Thank you all for being here.
Our guest today is Lindsay Whalen, and it is such a true joy to be able to welcome you into the conversation with us today, Lindsay.
We're here to talk to Lindsay about the beloved poet Mary Oliver, who we knew in common. Mary was born in 1935 in Maple Heights, Ohio, and she died in 2019 after enjoying an incredible career over 50 years, writing poems about Ohio, her home, and Provincetown, her adopted home. Mary won the Pulitzer Prize in 1983 for American Primitive and continued publishing her books until Devotions, which was published in 2018, a year before her death.
Lindsay's writing the first biography of the poet Mary Oliver, forthcoming from the Penguin Press. She's the recipient of the CUNY Graduate Center's Levy Center for Biography Fellowship, and she's a graduate of Brooklyn College's MFA in fiction. Lindsay began her career in publishing and continues to work with authors as an independent editor. And I would like to just add, she's one of the deepest friends of this go of a lifetime. We met almost 25 years ago, and which is wild to think, but there we were, freshmen in college. And one of the reasons that I'm most grateful and just feel such a happiness in my heart to be in conversation today in this way is that it really feels like a reflection of the spiral of time and how synchronicity weaves, lives together through time. And so I kind of wonder if we could just kind of start there, because it's in introducing you, Linz, we have to also weave in, David and David's relationship with Mary, and then Mary's relationship with the world, and and you going to Florida to Mary's doorstep and being like, here I am, and all of it. It's like it's all hung on the same loom, the same spiral. So grateful to have you here with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Shawn, you are really at the beginning of my understanding and interest in Mary Oliver. Shawn was the first person to introduce Mary Oliver's poetry to me, and it meant a lot to me at that time, and then continued to accrue meaning, not gradually, really kind of incrementally in these big bursts over the years to follow. And then when it happened that I did begin to start work on this biography and talk to you about it, we realized immediately that there was this other friend in the room that was the connective tissue, and that friend is David. And Shawn and David had established a relationship in DC around poetry and around yoga, and I'll allow them to talk about that. But David was a dear friend of Mary's, really one of the only poet friends of Mary's. And so it felt like this very intense blessing on the project that there was this really strong, really warm chain of friendship already there, already embedded. Certainly, I think it did a lot toward establishing trust between, from Mary towards me because David was this trusted common person. Although I had not yet met David, I already felt like I did. But sometimes I almost forget that Shawn did not know Mary because there's such a natural connection there. And they just would have loved being in a room together, I think.
Thank you. I go back to like the way that we get to know, sort of anyone because, and Mary talked a lot about this, that like, most of her dearest friends were people she never met. They were on the
Oh,
page.
absolutely. I mean, that's a great place to reach towards, Shawn, because absolutely, when in the essay that I wrote after Mary's death, I talked about her deep friendship with the poet James Wright, which was entirely through poetry and letters. They never met. They were never in the room together, though of course they were in many rooms together. And there was a way in which the way that she grieved for him, the way that she loved him in her life, the fact that they hadn't spent shared time really didn't matter.
Okay, so she said like Whitman was the brother I did not have, right? Like that there is a sense of intimacy that can form like kinship, literary kinship that can form through the page. And I think that so many people have that kind of connection with the great poet Mary Oliver, right? And of course, I've had the blessing over many years to kind of, and I think this might be why you forget that I didn't actually know Mary in person, is that I feel the familiarity, the warmth of of her through both of you and your relationships with her.
Yeah, I truly do feel that everyone who does have that, every reader that has that feeling that they knew her, it is correct in that feeling. That it is an authentic understanding. It's not all encompassing, it's not everything, but it's true.
Mhm. Why do you think that is? What is it about her writing? How is that achievable in a way?
Well, that's the great mystery, right? I think all great writing shares in common just this extraordinary authenticity and to varying degrees immediacy. But her immediacy was one of her true goals, to feel, to be felt and understood without an implement, without mediation, without need for external reference, that someone could enter the poem immediately. And that she was able to so often achieve that goal is one of the extraordinary facts of her writing life. Yeah.
If I could just ask you to retell the story that you told in that extraordinary essay on Mary and James Wright, the story of you proposing the biography to her in 2016 and what happened, because it's really interesting. It says a lot about how Mary operated with those on the outside and those who she allowed in on the inside.
I'll tell a slightly streamlined version because it's always more complicated than it appears. But I had been very interested in the life and work of Mary Oliver for some years, and that interest that began in really with Shawn bringing me into the world of her poetry deepened when I was an editor working for Penguin Press, which is the last house that published the work of Mary Oliver. I did not know Mary as an author, as a person in my time working for Penguin Press. But what happened was I left publishing to focus on my own writing and had this very small seed of an idea, but that there was the possibility of a Mary Oliver biography. And the only reason I was able to nurture that idea or return to it at all was because of an essay that Mary wrote called Steepletop was first collected in the essay collection, Blue Pastures. It is very much about the art of biography and its complications. And I sensed in that essay a real ambivalence about biography that I think hadn't really been part of a public understanding of Mary Oliver, her work. She had by that time was well known to be private, said no to most interviews. But I had this feeling in reading that essay that this woman was in fact quite interested in biography and had been shaped by it in various ways and troubled by it deeply. Eventually, through her publisher, I wrote a letter asking if she might meet and might consider the idea of her biography. Eventually, she read the proposal, was interested enough, I guess, in what I had written that she agreed to meet. And so that was in June of 2016. And that would be the first of many meetings that went on between that time and the end of her life in January 2019.
And you went to Florida to meet with her the first time in 2016?
Yes. That was June of 2016 was the first meeting.
I
Right.
mean,
But
you
she
call it
didn't come
that
to the
because it was almost not a meeting. It was almost a non-meeting.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm skipping over the part that I touched upon in the first. I she had agreed the first time that she the first time that she said yes to meeting was a month before, and I went down to Florida, and she had said, "Come and call me from the airport," and so I did. And
Did she give you a date, Lindsay? Did she say, come on a certain day and call me from the
yes,
airport?
I wouldn't have had to use a word that Mary liked to use. I wouldn't have had the chutzpah to, um, or the moxie. She liked the word moxie. I would not have had the moxie to, um, to have just flown there without a date in mind. But I did, fly on the assigned date, called her, and for complicated reasons, that I was not made privy to at the time, I was she could not meet. And so I spent a few days in Florida really just kind of wandering around, wondering what the fate of this project would be, wondering as you do what the reason why we were not meeting was. Um, and then and then we reconvened, a month later. So, I think in some ways that first failed meeting was, of course, a disappointment and a confusion. But I think that the idea that this would all happen was so remote to me at that time. I was just doing you were acting out of a sort of instinct and without knowing what would come next. And so I didn't experience it as quite the devastation or roadblock that maybe I would have in different circumstances. I mean, it was so I mean, just to give context, I mean, I have to assume that this is true. At one point I asked Mary if anyone had ever asked her to write her biography, and she said no. I mean, that's sort of the extent of her authority, I guess I would say, is she had so firmly established who she was, what the limits on what she was able to give were, that nobody challenged that.
David, can I ask you a question? Lindsay's bringing us into, going from knowing Mary Oliver, the great poet, the beloved, um, American figure, to like on the page, to kind of like landing a little bit more intimately in her world and having to negotiate sort of like the kind of authority that she had established around like, a perimeter of privacy in her life, vis-a-vis the public, right? Like writ large, not like her neighbors, but, and then coming in and sort of in this tenderizing process over time, coming into relationship with her. And my question for you, David, is how did that happen for you? I know you met Mary years and years, prior, also through the page.
I think what your experience was, Lindsay, is very close to what mine was over a longer span of time. Uh, in the essay you wrote, you were describing waiting around at the hotel to hear back from her for I don't know how many days it was, and finally, you did eventually get to meet her, and when she threw the door open, once you step into the Grail Castle, you're in. And she even contacted me about you and said, "Well, there's somebody who wants to write my biography," and I was very doubtful at first, but then I met her and I read her writing, and she's wonderful, and I'm going to go forward with it. So, she takes or took time to consider who she was going to let in. But when she let you in, you were all in. I mean, you were a member of the little family that was always sort of surrounding her, and the personages changed over time, but there was always a little group that was surrounding her. So for me, I met her within a few months of her having chosen my book for an award because I wrote her a letter to thank her for changing my life, and she wrote me back, and I wrote her back, and then finally she asked me to come to Bennington to give a reading, and at Bennington, we just really hit it off. I was shocked at how accessible she was, how lovely she was, and how protective of me she was, even though she only had known me for a few months. And then over the next 5 years, we corresponded by letter, and, I saw her again. I think it wasn't until 2005 when we gave a reading together in Denver that I saw her again. And then finally in 2007, she invited me to come and stay at uh, her condo in Provincetown, and, I mean, this should say something, once you're allowed into the castle, she gave me her bedroom upstairs on the 2nd floor. And, Percy slept in the bed with me and peed all over me because he was so upset, that it wasn't Mary. But, I mean, even having, the dog pee on me was part of the experience, and, I felt, "Wow, I'm really in now. I am totally in."
Oh my.
That experience of her holding back and then throwing the doors open is a very familiar one for me.
That's so I don't know that I had heard you describe the conditions of the first meeting and that you were actually sleeping in her bedroom, which is just so wonderful, so immediate, and such a powerful image. I wanna underscore also just how extraordinary it is that Mary at the time that we met, it was she was in a different place in her life. But David, for you and connecting as 2 poets, I said in the beginning that she had very few poet friends, and I mean, it's really true, especially contemporary poet friends. And so the fact of your choosing one another is just extraordinary.
I don't know how I got so lucky. It could have been so many other people.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true at all. I think it was very necessarily not so many other people. And I think that there was she said to one other poet friend that I can think of, the late Frank Gaspar, of course, is a dear friend, but the late poet Pat Fagnoli, who had been an adult student of Mary's. And
Mhm.
when I spoke with Pat about their friendship, she said that in a letter Mary had once written to her that you are in my ken. And
Mhm.
that was what it was. She felt for the people that she felt strong affinity towards, it was a deep, familiar connection and one that you could trust was sustained even during periods of silence. So, like you said, David, that there was periods in the beginning of your knowing each other when you were not constantly in touch, and that was just, not the rhythm of the friendship in that moment. But then it shifted and changed, and there was much more regular contact. But it didn't mean that in those periods of silence you were any less dear.
I'm smiling all over just being with you two, because being with you two feels like the next best thing to being with Mary. And I wanted to say too that Molly, her partner, was sick and dying in those years from 2000 to 2005. So she was taken up with that, and I even have a letter from her saying that, you know, everything that Molly is experiencing is very stoic. It was like Marcus Aurelius had written it, but that Molly is experiencing is just the normal progression of great old age, and despite all of it, she's very um, chipper and doing well. And so, even her letters about Molly's dying were optimistic. And so she wasn't suffering in those years, but she was certainly occupied with all of the stuff of real life. And and as you know, she was at the top of her powers at that point. She had
Yeah.
written "Belief in the Cloud" in 1999, and it's, to me, the great accomplishment of her career.
A wonderful book, and not well enough known. I'm struck by that phrase, David, the real stuff of life, because I think that was entirely her focus, the real, the what she saw as the real stuff of life, and it was a particular vision of what that meant. I'm thinking of a letter from that she wrote in midlife where she's saying, "I know what is real and what is not." Something so simple and so difficult to achieve.
And I would say, just because you are reflecting to each other the uncommon nature of her letting you in, right? And there is something that I would want to reflect to both of you about the real stuff that you are made of, that rather than the prioritization of like construct, like professionalism, no, it's presence, it's practice. My sensing into the journey for both of you of really coming into relationship with Mary was about her kind of sniffing you out, like her taking her time and leveling her gaze at you and going, "Are you made of the real stuff of life? Do you understand? Do you get my vision?"
Oh, yeah. You felt with Mary, I'm sure, David, you felt the same. When she looked at you, she really looked at you. I mean, it was a sustained gaze and, not frightening, not intimidating, um, but sustained and not afraid to keep looking.
The way in her work and the way in her life was to look longer rather than to look away.
Right. And David, when I think about what I actually miss about being in her physical presence, it's that. Not even talking necessarily, not even an exchange, but being with someone who is able to sustain that level of presence. I in some ways I miss her less than another person I might have lost because I'm in such constant contact with her. with the poetry, with her letters, with the reality of her impact on the world, she feels very alive to me in all these major ways. But that quality of sustained presence that you felt just on an energetic level being next to her, that is gone.
Could you read something that you brought, Lindsay? We have a little tradition on the show where our guests read a selection of their choosing, and you've chosen a few interesting things here to spark our conversation about Mary.
I just went to the Winter Hours essay and
Yeah,
the kind of muscular nature of like
Mhm.
being in relationship and what's hope about in
yeah.
relationship.
I'm gonna read the quote from the essay, even though it's maybe a bit unusual to choose prose in a conversation about Mary Oliver, but prose was a important part of her work, especially in the second half of her career. And so I'll just read from Winter from Winter Hours. In the winter I am writing about, there was much darkness. Darkness of nature, darkness of event, darkness of the spirit, the sprawling darkness of not knowing. We speak of the light of reason. I would speak here of the darkness of the world and the light of, but I don't know what to call it. Maybe hope, maybe faith, but not a shaped faith. Only, say, a gesture or a continuum of gestures. But probably it is closer to hope that is more active and far messier than faith must be. Faith, as I imagine it, is tensile and cool and has no need of words. Hope, I know, is a fighter and a screamer.
Why did that one come to mind?
I've been looking at a lot of the winter poems and at the Winter Hours essay. Mary grew up in a place in Northeast Ohio that had intense winters and then moved to a place that became her longtime adopted home, Provincetown, that also had intense different winters, very different, but really felt seasons, really intense seasons. In Northeast Ohio, you're seeing incredible snowfall. In Provincetown, less snowfall, but extraordinary isolation.
The passage here, the sprawling darkness of not knowing. That of all the darknesses, then she's talking about darkness of nature, darkness of event, darkness of the spirit, the sprawling darkness of not knowing. Not knowing seems to be the overarching quality that pulls all of these darkness together. And it's so, what you've chosen here to me is so central to her project, her lifelong project, which is that I would rather live in the palace of discovery than the palace of knowledge. I would rather find out for myself than to be told what's true.
Yeah, I think it's the not knowing, I think in her lightest moods or modes, the not knowing is really held up as a state of wonder, where you're just in this procession of questions, who made the world, all of the questions that she is known for, and a delight in questioning. I think one of the reasons I'm drawn to this passage is I think she's really acknowledging that there can be a dark edge to that not knowing, that it can really hurt and it can feel so lonely.
I feel in this, it's like a Joanna Macy's sense of like active hope. The notion that like it's not something passive at all. Like it's not cool and tensile. M- it's what do we do with this not knowing? What do we do with the darkness? Can we grapple with it? Can we have, like, in her famous poem, The Clam, like a muscle that loves being alive inside of us?
Right. That's what the hope is. The hope is the muscle that loves being alive. It's this it's it's the animal nature that is crying for life against all odds.
A fighter and a screamer.
Yeah. There's nothing sentimental about that. It's so raw.
And that, it's just a fighter and a screamer. And I think if she were here, she was, the poetry is a fighter and a screamer. She is more of hope than she is of faith. I truly believe. I think there are experiences of faith, like experiences of grace, or um, but that it was this work, joyful work often, but work, and a quest and a search. When she's referring to maybe faith, but not a shaped faith, only say a gesture or a continuum of gestures. She was looking for these gestures that were the rope that pulled to pull you through the darkness. All of the imagery, all of the sunrises of Mary Oliver poetry are our gesture to pull one out of darkness. And, we think of her as the poet of dawn or the poet of the sunrise. But what that really means is that you're the poet of darkness, because you don't see the sunrise unless you're in the dark.
It's so great. It's so great. I love how it ends here too when you say, or when she says that, and has no need of words. Faith, as I imagine it, is tensile and cool and has no need of words. Hope, I know, is a fighter and a screamer. So hope is the engine of words.
I think she was attracted to silence in many ways, in winter as the season of silence. And I think sometimes had a feeling that silence was the preferred state, that you could, that in the best of times there was no need for words, or there were no words. Why was it then that she was as prolific as she was? Why did she pursue the language in the steadfast way that she did? How was she as prolific? I think in part because she chose silence in so many other areas of life, and so that the poetry was this great pouring forth of this spirit that didn't express itself in a more traditional way. It was a very chatty spirit. She had a lot that she, did not keep to herself. We think of, for all of her privacy, the privacy was in a way the thing that sustained the constant gift giving of the words. She was always writing. She was always sending poetry out. It was constant.
It seems that that one of Mary's sort of knacks as a spirit and as a poet was allowing the direct, deep examination of what's here, the life that's here, the small things, to really be the portal through which the big things, the kind of eternal pulse, could be felt in her writing. And she does this like in this piece, but I'm thinking about, poems like In Blackwater Woods, or, First Snow, or even like The Summer Day. She's really touching down. She's willing to be with, like, studying the seasons, studying the moment in time, whether that's the depth of silence or a kind of deepening darkness, despair turning inward, or this kind of like urgent joy. So I wonder, in your kind of like fidelity of your study, what do you make of how she studied the turning of time?
as I've been thinking about the seasons more, how they appear in her work, you know, the seasons in poetry it's an ancient theme, and there's nothing new, or one could think there's nothing new to be found in returning there. And certainly I think that was the overarching feeling in poetry during the years when she was establishing her career. There was a great movement away from poetry that was focused on the natural world. And yet it's where it was it was her great subject, and she knew that from the start. If you look at her first book, I mean, an interest and an examination of the seasons is present from the beginning, but it's much more traditional, in the first book, and it's clearly in dialogue with all of the poets that she knew and studied. It becomes a lot more personal and a lot more charged as her work develops, and I think in part because when she comes to really marry the seasons, the seasonal rhythms and the diurnal rhythms, that for her, like the day and the year were in really deep conversation, in a really deep spiritual conversation. When we think of her as the great poet of dawn, um, the way that sun carried her through the day and through the year. I think that brings a particularity to what would be, the world of Mary Oliver's seasons as opposed to another poet. I think she clearly was really working with what is common in our understanding of what spring is and what summer is and what fall is and what winter is, and the immediacy that's available to anyone from evoking those sort of traditional scenes. But I think when she brought that together with the very almost monastic rhythm of her working day, it became something much more potent and much more mysterious in a way. So that winter and darkness are kind of intertwined in this really deep way in her work.
Can I ask you, Lindsay, what was your impression of Mary's day-to-day um, confrontation with life? Do you think that she suffered from depression in these references to darkness? Or do you think that the darkness of not knowing felt different from depression? I'm just curious about your experience because I never get to talk to anyone who knew her.
I'm hesitant to extrapolate too much from my time with her, because again, I think it's sort of similarly, David, to how you were talking about Mary's writing about Molly at the end of her life. I met her so clearly at what was the end of her life. It ended up being a more extended period of time, I think, than we imagined, but she was in a very particular season of her own life. And so I don't know that I have you may have insights that I don't about what was sort of typical, I guess, about her attitude or her approach. And in some ways, I think that the extraordinary acknowledgement of time's passage, the ability to both really focus on the moment, but also while also taking a really distant view, I think, of how time worked for in a human life, and also just for human beings. I think more than anybody I've ever been with in my life, Mary had this view of eternity. Like the spirit, that she was in contact with an eternal spiritual world, and also in contact with the reality that the life that she had experienced here on Earth, the sort of particularities of the natural world that she experienced here on Earth were not forever. And I think that played very much into her understanding of herself as a poet of the natural world, especially at the end of her life, where she was, I don't even know, yes, with sadness, but also with just sort of a degree of resolve that, you know, I'm probably mis this isn't a direct quote, but she said something like, "I'm beginning to understand that my most lasting value might be in having been a testament to what the natural world was in this moment of time." That it would not any long just as the woods of her childhood no longer existed by the time she was in her 80s. The seasons as she knew them, the coastline as she knew it, was unlikely to remain.
I like what you're saying there, that became the life work that she had been doing all along, which was to bear witness to the the fading away of this natural world and loving it all the more for its mutability. I mean, in my experience with her, at the end of her life, when she was in the last phase of the cancer, I saw her maybe for 10 minutes. I drove across Florida to see her, and her last words to me were "no moping," and no moping has become, it's like the keep trying in your what you saw, written onto the typewriter when she was struggling to write. The keep trying and the no moping all come from the same place. Maybe there's a distinction, I'm just thinking of it now, between the faith that she's talking about in that passage, which is the faith of daily life, moving through daily life silently, and the hope of writing and the kicking and screaming is the work of the writer. But in her daily life, I saw evocations of this continuum of gestures that she's speaking of. I just saw gesture after gesture of, you know, yes, I'm willing. Yes, I'm in it. Yes, I'm here to experience all of this. And I keep checking myself because I don't want to be the one person who is saying that, that the life of Mary Oliver is not what it appeared to be. It actually was what it appeared to be to me. What she's
Mhm.
telling me on the page and what I experience are very consistent, and it's this keep
Yes,
trying and open.
yes. And that's just to go back to the beginning of our conversation where I said, I think readers who feel themselves to know Mary Oliver truly do, because whatever it is, I think people often ask me, "Oh, are there things you've been surprised by? Or are there ways that you didn't know her?" Sure, but not in the essential ways. The devotion to the life that she lived, the devotion to poetry, the devotion to the natural world were as steadfast as they appear to have been. That's almost that's almost difficult for I think that's quite difficult actually for people to believe, and maybe if I hadn't met her, it would be difficult for me to believe too, but it's true.
What can you both share about what you observed of Mary's gem tactics? It's another way of
Mhm.
speaking about, like, what does the muscle that loves being alive do with itself? Like, how is it that we, each of us, learn to show up and again and again, and that is such a creative and authentic discovery process.
David, do you wanna answer first or
Well, a lot of it is what we're both saying, and
Yeah.
the pencils in the woods,
Yeah.
the taking of the walk, and coming home to Molly asking, "How was it?" The sitting at the typewriter and compiling the work into a black notebook a 3-ring notebook, making small markings on the poems, not intense revisions, but just small markings on the poems that she typed out herself, not talking so much about the work, and keeping it a cherished secret. The willingness to write even when there might be nothing there, and the bravery to see it for what it is, to say, "Oh, there's nothing there." These are things that all writers talk about, but I struggle to name more because she kept those practices very close to her chest. And I talked to her about it quite a lot. I mean, there were dozens of visits, and she would carry around you could speak more about this, Lindsay, because you've read these small notebooks. She carried around these little notebooks in her pocket, and she had yellow sticky notes up and down the stairs at Provincetown with magical written on them. There was everything about her way in the world was write it down and maybe use it for later.
And she also, once in an interview said, "I'm a scribbler." And that's really, the humility of that, just that word choice. I'm a scribbler. And she was, David, you're talking about post-it notes, but it was really, as sort of beloved as this image of the pencils and the trees has become, or her little notebook in the pocket, it was all of those things. And it was also just like whatever envelope was in front of her or the post-it note. Not all of those pieces of paper still exist. There are many that have been, lost to the dust zone. But because of what she did decide to save, I can speak a little bit to what it was that she decided to scribble and how it made its way into the work. Any reader, any deep reader of her work will know some of these thoughts from the sand dabs that she published. Those are all pulled really from notebooks. These little, often aphoristic scraps of wisdom or observation that she began to publish later in her life. But often it was less profound than that, less obviously meaningful than that. And what she was often doing was citing, seasonal phenomenon. Like it was from, and this is a practice that's carried from childhood. She would write a, a bird that she saw, just write the name of the bird. Sometimes she'd put, the date next to it to tell her, when that bird showed up that year. And she knew the comings and goings of these animals so well that she knew when it was unusual and when things weren't as they should be. It was the first, songbird of late winter, early spring was always an event for her. Always. It was something she waited for and looked for and that had true meaning. She told me because she knew that I would be looking, through the notebooks, and she said, "You're going to find a page that just says "woof!" exclamation point." And that was the first day that she saw a coyote in Provincetown. And now coyotes are plentiful in Provincetown, but until then, they hadn't been there. And that's sort of just, the playfulness of that scribbling book. Like that playfulness was so much a part of who she was. Probably the thing that I miss most, David, second to, just the steady presence of her gaze, is her laugh. I mean, she was funny. She laughed and she loved to make people laugh. She loved to make friends laugh in casual conversation. She loved to make audiences laugh. I mean, it was a huge pleasure for her. And something that she was much better able to do in the final years of her reading life. And I think that's another, talking about the final years of her reading life and the degree of comfort and intimacy that she had with her enormous audiences at that stage, I think a real testament to, this was this deeply seasonal person who understood the passage of time and understood the seasons of a lifetime and understood, what youth was and what old age might be. And yet there she was, this, septuagenarian poet rock star, at exactly the moment that most people slow down, she sped up. So I think there was a way that she also relied on working against the seasons in this kind of triumphant way of like a great demonstration of her truly extraordinary will. I mean, powerful, powerful will.
The will is connected to the hope
Right.
because she kept going. She would show up at a reading. She fell. I don't know where this was. You probably know, but
That was in New York when she hurt her head.
she said, "I look like a Civil War soldier, but I'm fine, and I'm going to give this reading anyway." She had people rolling in the aisles. She had a great sense of humor.
Great sense of humor, great sense of play. I think if we're going to look at the sort of the opposite of winters is summer, right? And summer, I think of in the kind of cosmos of Mary Oliver as the season of play. It so is the spirit of Provincetown in that season, but it was also like in her life, she and Molly for many years, for decades, had this tiny cottage on the water in Provincetown that no longer exists. And that was when, summer is the season of the friends come and and everyone's in and out and it's that kind of delicious experience of not knowing, of like, there's a reason why the questions of the summer day don't feel in any way malignant. It's just this joyful, like lazy, cloud gazing ponderousness.
I just want to say as a side note that Mary must have known how right this match was in choosing you for this, even though you came to her and asked her permission to begin this work. She must have known because I'm sitting here in your presence, and I feel the dedication that this has required. How has it been for you to live with her for 9 years? I mean, you're basically she's your daily partner in life.
Oh gosh, it's so hard because it does, again, life, it doesn't feel like it's been that long and yet it has. She's such good company, remains such good company, even in her absence. Such an incredible reminder of what is real when that question starts to feel confusing in your own life. And when you find yourself wondering what is real, a great tie to reality. There were a lot of things that I've had to learn, both about her life, about the poetry, questions that needed to be answered or approached at least if they couldn't be answered. And there were a lot, and there continue to be a lot of things that I have to unlearn. This is such a different, such a different life that she lived, to her contemporaries. And I think as a first time biographer, you're learning your craft and you're looking to other studies of other lives and seeing where you can learn things. And so much of what I looked to at different stages as I learned to write this book really were not relevant to this life and this body of work.
Mhm.
And a letting go of that has been one of the biggest journeys, I guess, of the last 9 years of saying, like, don't try to fit this into something that it isn't, and to really try to get to what is essential and particular about this life that has so much to offer so many people.
It reminds me of what you said earlier, or both of you reflected about being in Mary's presence and feeling that she would just hold your gaze for a long time. And that is so often what is necessary to study the life that's there and to get underneath whatever cliches.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, so Mary first moved to Provincetown in 1963. It's really, she's immediately writing about Provincetown. It's immediately present in the poetry, but she was not really able to make use of that landscape in the way that the full potential of that imagery until she had lived there for many years. She required a level of intimacy with what she was looking at with her environment, that allowed her to sort of not be on high alert. Like, she didn't travel very often, but, during a trip to Asia that she took in the '80s, and, she had been really excited about this trip and thinking about what she might write while she was on on this trip, and she found she really couldn't make use of what she was seeing at all because she needed to know so much more. It needed to be so much more familiar to her in order for her to really make use of it. That's just the way that mind worked, that sensibility worked. She was much more attuned to and inspired by, like, these sort of very small changes that she perceived in a daily recovering of the same terrain.
That's an amazing insight. I'd never thought of it, but it's very true that the Ohio poems became Provincetown poems only in the 1980s. That there was a shift there away from after American Primitive. There was a shift towards House of Light, and you could see that the familiarity with the place, the association with home and constancy was now a different place, and the work shifted too. There's a different kind of light in those books from the '90s versus the books from the '80s and the '70s.
It also just gives me more appreciation, Lindsay, as we hold this conversation in this moment in time, knowing that what it means to enter into the kind of the world, the kingdom of another person's interior. And what a deep act of fidelity and study that is. It's a thread that you're following through time in a real way, the real stuff of Mary's life conveyed through the medium of you and your writing. And I truly couldn't imagine someone better to faithfully hopefully with that kind of muscle of hope to take on this project that is surely a gift to the world. You wrote about Mary something, you said, so much of what I know about Mary Oliver is reflected in this simple page that she wrote to James Wright. And you said the willingness to be direct, the understanding of despair, and the insistence on joy. And when I read that, I actually I just kind of laughed out loud because I was like, that's Lindsay. That's you. The willingness to be direct, understanding of despair, and an insistence on joy. So thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you for this work that you're doing. It's so important, as Shawn says, to the world, and you're the one. You're the one to do it. Thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you for talking with me about it. It's nice to feel like there are companions on the long road.
We're a little tavern on the road, the fire burning.
We're a little tavern, a little guest house.
Yay.
Thank you so much for joining. If these conversations resonate for you, we'd be so grateful if you'd like, subscribe, or leave a review wherever you listen. This work is freely offered, but paid subscriptions make it possible.
You can also check out our work at davidkeplingerpoetry.com and shawnperel.com. You'll find both links in the show notes. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and each other.